or other products in general or locally that are in short supply. And that language is somewhat similar to language in the World Trade Organization agreements, but the reference to foodstuffs in particular in short supply, that is something that's added. So it shows you that this is something that really was in the minds of the negotiators when they did the AFCFTA. But also interesting, however, is that one of the major barriers, so we've looked here in this chapter to increasing trade in food in the continent, right? In the AFCFTA continent, and what the barriers are to do that within the continent. And what we found in the book is that tariffs are not the main constraint, indirect tariffs and things like that. The main constraint are non-tariff barriers to trading food products within the continent. And those tend to be quite high. Now, what are non-tariff barriers? It's basically a catch-all phrase to include lots of different things from, for example, testing requirements to border control measures and custom issues to quantitative restrictions to sanitary and phytosanitary requirements, that, for example, say you cannot have more than X maximum residue levels in a product in order to trade, et cetera, right? So it's everything that could be a barrier, but that's not a tariff, right? So those are the biggest obstacle to trading food in the continent, and addressing those could therefore increase food trade in the continent. That could be part of addressing food insecurity, because it means that if there is a drought in one part of the African continent, then trade and food doesn't need to come just from outside the continent, but can also be traded within, right, to address some of those situations going from surplus to deficit. So what provisions are there in the AFCFTA agreement to addressing those? There are not many food security specific provisions, but there are more general provisions that, however, if implemented, can make a difference from a food security angle. So those would be the provisions relative to or technical barriers to trade. There's a whole chapter, a protocol on technical barriers to trade in the AFCFTA, and they talk about harmonizing standards between different countries, mutual recognition of standards. So, you have standard A in your country, there's standard B in another country, but you agree that this gets to the same level of protection. So you're going to agree for that standard to be used without having to prove you align with the standard in the country you're importing to, right? So there's provisions around that, provisions that encourage developing standards on the basis of relevant international standards, or developing regional standards where they don't exist. So all of that can be helpful for food security, especially also those relevant to, say, warehousing or waste management or things around the supply chain of food, right? It's not just about the actual food product and processing. It's also about the infrastructure around that. That's equally implicated in trade and TBT issues, etc. Another one is the sanitary and phytosanitary agreements with SPS, as it's called, which is a subset of TBT, which focuses basically on measures that seek to advance human, plant, and animal life or health, basically including measures to minimize pest and disease outbreaks, right? So I say regionalization measures, or measures that limit harmful ingredients in food products, things around all of that. So that too will have implications for food security, especially because the SPS agreement, the protocol in the AFCFTA, is trying to make sure that those SPS requirements are not barriers to trading food and to recognizing, other countries as measures. So you actually have examples, I think it's from the East African community, where harmonizing levels of aflatoxin in maize and in rice actually significantly increased trade of those products, and that after this was done at the regional level. So there's a huge connection here to the food security issue. Another element there is trade in seeds. Seeds to plant the food. Those are also subject to sanitary, phytosanitary regulations. And, this has been a barrier in East Africa in particular, because typically a country can ask for 1 or 2 or 3 years of trials before a new seed variety is approved. And this means that if you have a really high yielding variety, which could produce a lot more food and take care of food security issues, you may not always have immediate access to it. So if you have agreements to recognize testing already being done in a similar climate, that could speed this up, and you could thereby facilitate access to those higher yielding seeds, and again tackle some of these food security issues. So that's another one. And then finally, another set of protocols annexes in the AFCFTA, they deal with trade facilitation. And I'm sure many of you, I mean, working on trade, everyone's familiar with those large lines of trucks trying to cross a border, but are waiting, right? Because different custom formalities have to be complied with. Now, if that truck has perishable goods, then it has to wait for a day at the customs. It can basically make that consignment valueless when it arrives at destination, right? So speeding up custom procedures is critical for food security. And the AFCFTA has 3 different annexes on trade facilitation and related issues. There's one on trade facilitation, there's one on customs cooperation, and there is one on transit, if I am not mistaken. And all of these provisions, taken together, they go beyond, say, trade facilitation provisions in the WTO. They also have a trade facilitation agreement, but these ones go a little bit further. And if implemented, they can significantly reduce the waiting time at the border, at customs. For example, this can be done by a single window. So you don't have to go to 3 or 4 different authorities, or a customs authority when you exit, and then a new customs authority when you enter the next country, right? The double checking. This If you have a one stop shop, right, that does the import and the exporting part, that could facilitate a lot of this. So that is another significant element where even though, yes, food security is not mentioned, perishable goods are mentioned, but that could significantly speed up and facilitate trade of agriculture products within the African continent. There are a few others. And what's interesting, maybe just to mention here, is that what the agreement doesn't have is a chapter on agriculture, right? The AFCFTA doesn't have a chapter on agriculture. If you look at the WTO, they have a chapter on agriculture. And there are reasons for which there is no chapter on agriculture, which I think make a lot of sense. Because what does the chapter on agriculture in the WTO try to do? It tries to basically minimize trade distortive measures like subsidies, domestic support subsidies that are market distortive, or different types of export subsidies, or quantity restrictions. So they try to reduce all of that so that there is less market distortion. Now, a lot of African countries don't subsidize agriculture production very much because there's no fiscal space, right? So there is a reason for why there may not have been a need for that. At the same time, regional economic communities agreements, the RECs, they include a few more provisions directly related to food security that are not in the AFCFTA. And this includes provisions about, say, common stock holding, right, in case of an emergency, that you can actually tap into that, or provisions around common irrigation practices or things like that. So there's also that element that didn't make it into this AFCFTA agreement for probably a variety of reasons, but that are a bit more advanced at the regional level. And because the AFCFTA builds on the RECs, right, those provisions are still there as well and shouldn't be forgotten.
A lot of insight, Colette, you have shared on food security, even including the single window that you mentioned. I must tell you, they have a single window arrangement, but I can tell you, you'll find multiple windows, multiple physical windows that give you more blockade. And that's why you see these trucks that you talk about with perishable goods staying at our borders so long. So trade facilitation is much, much, much needed, and that is very, very important. Let me take you to my very final question, and we read out questions from the chats. I can see quite a few already. Let's talk about trade, climates, and the future of work. All right. Climate change is already altering Africans' production patterns, We are not doing well on food production, but there is shifting rainfalls, there's shrinking arable land that we so much have a lot.
Oh.
There is changing crop variety, like you mentioned, and its access is even problematic. This makes trade policy itself very, very, stiff. Food policy is inseparable from trade policy. And so these investment rules and the digital systems and the climate provisions are all very important. Perhaps maybe AFTA can help to create that green, traceable, worker-friendly, value chains. The ILO, as we like to always call for that decent work framework,
Mhm.
shares that new emerging ideas about green industrial policy, which argue that trade cannot just focus on GDP. It must protect livelihoods. It must upgrade skills. It must ensure transitions are just for farmers, for workers. So how can all these, in the face of this, global uncertain terrain we find ourselves in, as we started with the Trump administration's tariffs, and the geopolitics of today. Now you also have climate issues that America is backing out of some of these commitments. Um, so in terms of these investment rules and environmental provisions in the AFTA and other trade agreements, how can workers be protected so we can build this inclusive food system and ultimately inclusive economic growth for all?
Yeah. I think there's so many things going on in your question, Hod, that I may just unpack a little bit, but it's you're of course exactly identifying some of the issues. I think maybe so. I'm hearing environment, right? And I'm hearing just transition and protection and digital and the AFCFTA, and there's a lot going on there. Let me just offer a few things there. I think first on digital, the AFCFTA has a protocol on digital, right? A digital protocol. And I think that is really critical because there, essentially what it seeks to do is reduce barriers of trading digital, data and digital products and things like that among different African countries, by reducing, say, custom fees and things like that, et cetera. And I think also trade facilitation, and having rules on digital payments and paperless trading and all of that. So this could be really critical, and I think this could be really critical. Uh, in part because a lot of digital innovation is coming out of Africa, right? Kenya is known as the hub for, you've got M-Pesa, you've got a lot of other really well advanced digital applications, etc. You have quite a few of those digital applications that are being developed for farmers, right? I think there's a red tractor, there's a few others that basically allow farmers to, say, track the weather, even those that may not have a smartphone, right? Or, ways in which you can predict what's happening because a lot of the African farmers are it's rain-fed irrigation, right? It's not covered. You're dependent on where the rain goes, or so you need to know what's happening. There's also apps that allow you to say rent a tractor, for a day, like the Uber of tractors or things like that. So it could address some of the capital problems. So this is an opportunity where putting together this protocol, if it were to be in fact implemented, it could lead to, say, having some of the apps coming out of a place like Kenya being accessible across the continent, right? And that could therefore have enormous benefits for farmers, for food security, and also address some of this climate issue, because so much of this rain-fed farming is becoming more difficult because of climate change, right? Where predictability is becoming a more, more and more a serious issue. So this could be part of that element as well. But going to the environmental part of this, the AFCFTA doesn't have a chapter on the environment, right? There's no chapter on environment or sustainable trade or things like that. It's got a number of references to the environment, a bit similar to food security, a little peppered all over the agreement, including in the preamble and including in the exceptions chapter sections. But that doesn't mean that that there can't be a benefit, right? And that it cannot be leveraged to enhance sustainability practices, especially the protocol on investment has actually quite a few references to sustainability and sustainable investment, and climate change and what have you, and not lowering standards, for investment. In these areas. So I think that is an interesting innovation because it goes much beyond what we've seen in other investment agreements. Um, but more broadly, I think 2 points on, I think, the sustainability angle. I think one, this conversation is much broader than the AFCFTA and then Africa, right? And it comes up a lot if you're looking at trade and sustainability. It comes up a lot, especially in the so-called unilateral instruments coming out of, say, the EU, right? Like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism or the Deforestation-Free Products Regulation that have received a lot of pushback, right, from African countries for a variety of reasons. I think what's important there is to not forget, because that's all about mitigation, do not forget the adaptation part of the coin. And that is repeatedly not in the forefront of what's driving the bus, right? So I think that is something that African countries through the AFCFTA or through different regional blocs or individually have to continuously make as a message when they engage with trading partners to not forget about the adaptation part, because climate change is hitting the continent so heavily, right? And that is something that creates costs that shouldn't be carried by the continent alone. So I think that is one element. Another element is the fact that I mentioned earlier the importance of bridging industrial policy and trade policy and linking it in a more comprehensive way. Climate policies need to be part of that package, right? And it has to be linked to that as well. And so by taking a strategic approach to all these different elements, including sustainability and climate, uh, that could allow and enable African countries to better identify where their competitive advantages are in terms of different sectors, different industries, different services, different products, and subsequently what to steer the economy towards and create jobs in addition to what it already has, right? So I think a more proactive approach there that's linking those different elements that typically are being developed by different ministries, but linking them together under one umbrella could really have dividends in all these different elements.
Thank you very much, Colette, for um, in the multiplicity of sub questions, the way I put it, you still managed to break it down. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We will now open the floor to colleagues, comrades online who are putting in their questions in the chat box. Um, our interpreters will help us. Um, if our interpreters can read the 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 French questions first, I will take the English one, obviously. So if you can interpret um, the question written in the chat box in English, interpreter, that would be great, comrade. And then our French-speaking comrades can read the question from the chat box. Okay, comrade is interested about Benin. Is that Comrade Aline? It's interested in Benin. How do you create that strong policy and resilience for Benin? Is that there's another one in French as well?
70% of the population into this world trade. How can states strengthen their trade policy to adapt them to international standards and reduce the trade deficit?
Okay. Colette, you were talking about my questions. Now you have a combo
Great.
in one question. So
Great.
let's take these first, and then I see a few others. We'll go to that as well. Let's take these two
Okay.
first.
Which one do you want me to do first?
The Benin one.
The Benin one, the French one.
Yeah,
Yes.
the
Okay.
French one.
So I mean I can read French. I can try. I think I can figure out what's in that question. So how to adapt a resilient politics for Benin in light of the Trump administration and the tariffs. So, I mean, I think this goes very much into what we've been discussing, right? So, in this presentation, I didn't focus on all the specific countries. It's more an overall picture and an overall framework to be starting to think about some of these issues. But I think for an individual country, how to respond is very much dependent on how the country is affected specifically, right? So step number one would be to do a little bit of an assessment, if it's not already been done, to get a sense of what industries have been hit and with how much, and what industries will be hurt in the future, and what are the options that we've got to address this, right? And so I mentioned this a little bit already in the presentation, but I didn't go into too much detail on all of the different elements. One way to address it is to look at, I mean, one way to address it is uh, by creating compensational programs for those that have been hurt by this, right? By the losers of trade. I believe Benin is very agricultural dependent, cotton dependent, right, etc. So I don't know to what extent that is directly impacted by the Trump tariffs. But so one is to make an assessment of the export basket, the import basket, and where the vulnerabilities are. And the second one would be in those areas where there is anticipated layoffs or issues, finding ways to potentially strengthen the firms to hold on to the workers until more permanent solutions can be found through compensatory programs, for example, or providing unemployment benefits for those that are losing their jobs. Lesotho has, for instance, declared a state of disaster, not a state of emergency, a state of disaster, right? Which is different, but that gives the government some powers to enact, to have quicker access to funds, basically, to address some of the needs from the workers that have been laid off, etc. So that there is, depending on what is needed in the country, that might be an option. But I think before that's happening, if there aren't any massive layoffs yet happening, then the response would be much more in the strategic thinking part, right? Where are other industries that Benin could be focusing on? How can Benin potentially diversify its export destinations, right? If it is reliant on one place, where else can it go? And realistically, what is needed to do that, right? Because a lot of commentators talk about export diversification in the context of the Trump tariffs, right? And how to mitigate some of those impacts. But realistically, that depends on a lot of variables, right? You don't just go to another market. You need to find buyers. You need to create trust. You need to understand how to move that supply chain. And then that takes time, right? But I think this is the work that needs to be done by Benin, right? Like specifically applied to the Benin situation, and then based on that assessment, identifying where to go from there, and then linking this assessment to the broader industrial policy objectives, the broader sustainability objectives, the broader trade objectives of the country.
Great. What about the second part? The second one,
Okay.
talking about
Um,
70% of the population being youth.
so Africa is only 3% of uh, global commerce. So okay. How can that be read? I think the question is, uh, how can the country strengthen its participation in global trade in the context of the Trump administration? And then, as you say, how can it reduce uh, import dependence on other continents? And then the one about how to increase participation of youth. Um, and how trade can be reinforced to adapt to international standards and reduce the deficit for. Yeah. Okay, that's a lot of questions. And I think so very often, you know, to really, in my opinion, and from the work that I do, which often includes doing very technical work with governments on very specific issues, I often think it's really important to go granular, right? So to break down the bigger picture questions and the bigger picture issues into much smaller chunks of issues, and then addressing those issues, right? So it's very difficult to really in Africa can increase its share of global trade, right? That is where it is for a lot of different reasons. Of course, I think going again back to, you know, trade policy, industrial policy, I think that can play an important role, right? Strategically increasing the value chains that are being developed within Africa, right? Developing skills, putting in place the conditions to attract foreign direct investments, whether that is reducing energy blackouts or prices or facilitating access to ports or other things like that needs to be a package to make it attractive for foreign direct investments to increase the trade, the participation, etc. So I think that whole package needs to be addressed, and different countries can play a different role there. I think in particular, just a side note on critical raw materials, it's come up a few times, but we haven't zoomed in on it a little bit. But potentially there, I would say there is a huge opportunity for the African continent because a lot of the world is vying to access Africa's critical raw materials, right? And they're fighting over it essentially. It's like the new scramble that some have called it the new scramble for Africa, right? It's about who is having ownership and access of some of those critical raw materials that are used for so many electronics, environmental, solar cells, defense, things like that. Now, I think there is a huge opportunity. So because Africa has so many of them, the hydrogen, the renewable energy, what have you, and this is an opportunity to negotiate from a position of strength because there's that demand, right? So I think this is an opportunity to also increase Africa's trade percentage potentially if the cards are played well, right? And this needs to be done by not every country one against the other trying to get a better deal, nationally versus the neighbors, but by creating some set of coalitions that seek to get benefits for the larger bloc. So, and I think in the G20 in South Africa, but also the recently announced clean trade and investment partnership with the EU and South Africa, which is all around green hydrogen and certain types of raw material access and batteries and EV value chains and what have you. I think that suggests an opportunity to for the African continent to increase its negotiation position also in the larger trade context, right? If those elements can be linked, if it can be linked by saying you want access to the raw materials, fine, here is what we need in return, right? So I think this is something that really, if played, like if that negotiation is done well, could really benefit and ultimately have benefits for Africa's international trade participation. And that I guess goes hand in hand with the dependence on other continents. Then the youth and the population. So, Africa is blessed with an enormous youth population, which could be a great asset going forward, especially comparing that to, say, aging Europe, right? So that could be an enormous asset, and that could be used, especially in potentially attracting labor-intensive industries or things around those parameters. So I think that could be really something that can be strategically leveraged like that. I think that is, international standards. International standards is hugely important, right? And complying with them is typically a market access prerequisite, right? So how to improve that? I think a focus on doing that, enhanced role of standardization bodies, enforceability of the standards. The AFCFTA is also reinforcing commitment to some of those standards, like International Standards Organization and what have you. So I think that as an objective could also make a huge difference.
All right. I know we have some 10 minutes on the clock, so we will be quick about these questions. There is a question for you from Victoria. What are the long-term risks for African industrialization? if tariffs continue or worsen. That is Victoria from Kenya. Let's
Yeah.
do them one by one in a quick terms.
I will be quick, sure. I think that's a little bit going back to the discussion we've had, right? If there's continue or worsen, it will worsen Africa's competitive position vis-a-vis some competitors, especially in the industries that are most affected, like garments and apparel, food processing, and a few others, right? So that will, for industrialization purposes, be could be really have a huge disadvantage for the industrialization agenda because it will be
Mm,
impacting a lot of the manufacturing industries, right? So I
mm,
think that is something that needs to be kept in mind, and how what that means as to does the continent have to artificially support the industry to keep it going, or is rather the better approach to reskill and invest in other value chains? Those are really difficult questions, right, to answer in the abstract, and continents have to make those
mm,
decisions on the basis of their specific situations. I think on raw materials, as many of those are exempt from Trump's tariffs, there is an opportunity for the continent to not just export the raw commodities, but to really develop industrial capacity around more processed materials, right? So that could, in that regard, this might be an opportunity to really focus on some of these elements aligned with what I was saying earlier as well. But it's not looking good if those tariffs worsen, and if they worsen more for Africa than they worsen for competitors.
that is true. That is true. That's a question from Christoph. Are there new bilateral trade agreements in negotiation in Africa with non-traditional partners as a reply to the tariff increase by the US administration?
That's a great question. Um, I am not aware of any new ones, right? There's the Kenya, the ongoing one with Kenya. There's been some agreements like the one with Rwanda, which was more like a peace agreement, and the Congo. But I'm not aware of bilateral trade agreements in response to this. And if I am not, I wouldn't be surprised if there are none, because, or at least not with the LDCs, because those FTAs would be they're mostly done from a perspective of increasing trade between different countries that are typically uh, with done with some of the larger trading partners. But I'm not aware of any of those agreements. It is an interesting question, though. It could be that there are, but I just
Mm,
haven't seen them, because I
mm,
do think the question gets to also, perhaps thinking it one step further, what other partnership or developments or can be created in response to those Trump tariffs? What other deals could be set, right? There is the US EU agreement. There's a few other ones that have been negotiated. But where and what could be beneficial from the African continent's perspective? And I think that is a question that could be further that could gain further attention. What could that
mhm,
look like? Is there scope for a deal? I know South Africa has been lobbying the Trump administration very much because of its high tariff, and it's the impact of that tariff. So is that something that's in the works? I don't know. But could that be something that could minimize some of what we've seen in terms of the tariff impact? Potentially, yes. So I think that could be a
mm.
great kind of takeaway from the discussion, as an area of thinking that could be done to also give countries a tool in the toolbox to negotiate and to minimize some of those implications. Yeah.
Mm.
And
Good, 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 good.
that could be especially for the resource-rich countries, right? Because you need to have leverage for
Right.
these things.
Mm,
So those may be well positioned, better
mm, mm,
positioned for
mm.
for a potential agreement or deal. Probably not a full-fledged FTA, but something different.
It's something different. All right. Well, there's a question from Osajifo Marcos Tafari, a good friend from Zambia. He's asking you that do the Trump tariffs align with the global principles of trade justice,
Mhm.
or do they deepen structural inequalities between African producers and developed economies? What safeguards are needed to ensure that African countries are not the majority victims of geopolitical tariff conflicts? This is
Yeah,
from
also,
Osage.
thank you for the question. Also, great angle to bring into the discussion. Global principles of trade justice. Now, There is the WTO, right? The World Trade Organization, and I'm pointing because it's literally right there. But I wouldn't call those the global principles of trade justice. I would call those the multilateral trading framework, right? Which has principles of trade, not particularly trade justice, which I think are slightly different. And they can be aligned, but they don't have to. And in that sense, I think the Trump tariffs, it had lots of commentators have written on this. They're not in line with the WTO principles, right? They're a blatant violation of the MFN principle, right? And the MFN tariffs that the United States had negotiated as part of its WTO, membership. So that is not at all in that sense aligned. And countries have also been discussing this and taking that on board. Trade justice, I think, goes deeper than this because trade justice is a concept that's not just about the multilateral framework of trade principles, which is based on non-discrimination and fixed tariff lines, transparency, and what have you. This goes further than that, and I think trade justice is something that can only be achieved through a combination of different players, and that is the international trading system, but also national governments that tend to play the biggest role in ensuring that the losers are compensated, the losers of trade, right? And that's why you have just transition frameworks for environment, but also for trade, right? You have those in the US, you have those in Europe, you have those in other countries. So I think justice and whether what he's doing or the Trump administration is doing is aligned with trade justice. I mean, to the extent there are some of those principles out there, I think definitely not, right? It's not based on justice in any way or another. It's based, or it used to be based on some formula that was linked to a trade deficit, right? A US trade deficit, and on that basis was penalizing countries like Lesotho with 50%, which had which made very little rational sense, and then other countries got less. Now the tariffs are different because they've been revised down because I think it was an unfeasible situation. But justice and justice defined as, I guess, ensuring that the trading system is benefiting all to equal levels. That's not behind this system at all, right? I would suggest the opposite. I mean, it's created so much damage already, especially to the most vulnerable. Like
Yeah.
again, the Lesotho workers that have been laid off for a tariff threat that didn't even materialize, right? These are workers that have not only their families to support, but often also their extended families and their communities, whether they're relying on a single salary of a single garment worker in one of those factories, right? So that I think is very complicated, and I think many of us that are trade experts have been extremely frustrated with what's happened to the system, which still tries to create principles to make sure that everybody benefits, right?
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't always manage to do that. So I think there the answer is to get to trade justice, a lot of work needs to be done, and a lot of different players need to be on board. Trade is still very important, right? Trade is still critical to achieve economic growth, to create jobs, and to develop an economy, right? Trade can really be the lever to that trade and investment. And at the same time, it needs to be done such that there's no major casualties to that, right? And this is again where I think a lot of national programs need to come in.
Thank you, Colette. But in the name of justice, we will do justice to the very last question. Our interpreter will help us. It's a very short question in French by Fambai Ndoye. Can we have that read in English for us or interpreted?
I cannot see
I
the
think the
question.
question is about
Is it?
That
do
is,
you
I
think
think
yeah
it
they
comes
can
right after
Yes.
yeah
Victoria's
I see it.
question in the chat.
Do you think the AFCFTA
Okay, possible.
can
Okay,
succeed without free circulation in the
Okay.
yeah,
EU,
that's well
right?
translated.
Is
Yeah,
that I think it's the
there
EU,
exactly. You
not
got it.
the African Union. The
All right,
I
Colette,
think
you
that's
got
the
it.
question. And
Mm.
if that's not the question, then from bio, please say so. But I think that's the question. So, well, assuming it's the EU and not the African Union here, I think the AFCFTA can succeed I think, irrespective of existing barriers, perhaps in other continents, because predominantly because it seeks to enhance intra-African trade, right? The ACFTA is very much developed. I mean, you have the regional economic communities, and what the ACFTA does is it basically tackles the terms of trade between the blocks, right? So if you pay, I don't know, 20% tariff for exporting a garment from Kenya in the East African community to ECOWAS, then under the ACFTA, that tariff will be reduced, right? Or new trade terms apply, new provisions that seek to tackle non-tariff barriers and what have you. So whether or not the AFCFTA succeeds, I think, is predominantly a question of the political will in the continent, and in particular also whether there is the whether countries manage to overcome their disagreements with regards to the outstanding issues on rules of origin, especially on vehicles and on apparel, and also finalize their schedules of concession because some of these issues are pending. So we have the block, we have the agreements, a lot of the agreements. A lot of the texts are there and are well done, but now the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and whether this agreement will actually increase significantly intra-African trade will depend on the extent to which all of these elements get finalized, and the extent to which it gets implemented. And that is where there's still quite a bit of work to be done. So this is, I think, where the success of the AFCFTA depends on. The Trump tariffs, as I've mentioned, for some have been identified as the moment to step it up at the continental level. It could be an opportunity for that, but we still have to see whether indeed that will be taken up, right? So what's important is, and someone once told me, after the African continent doesn't need more agreements, but what it needs is implementation of the existing ones. And it would be, I think, really a shame if the AFCFTA will be part of the existing agreements that don't see much implementation. So all efforts have to go into making this document the basis on which countries are actually trading with each other, so that the benefits can be experienced. And then on the EU side, yes, I think I'll stop here. Yeah.
On the EU side, no, finish that sentence.
No, so what the EU is doing in terms of EU circulation there, I think whatever's happening in the EU, yes, it's all connected to a certain extent, but one is the intra-African project and the other one is the Africa-EU trade project, right? And so I would see them as they're connected, but they're different in that sense. The EU can support the AFCFTA. The EU is supporting the AFCFTA, I think, through certain types of, the aid for trade programs and things like that. It could support it by different types of implementation advice to the extent that that's desirable. And then, of course, the EU has its own trade agreements with different African countries, the EPAs, right, the economic partnership agreements. It also trades with the LDCs under the generalized system of the Everything But Arms program. So there are these existing programs as well. And it is currently looking at these different models, like the clean trade and investment partnership that I've mentioned, right? That they've just announced, or that they just signed off on a document with South Africa in the outskirts of the G20. So that's also developing, and that is approaching trade with the continent through a broader lens, putting together financing with investment, with sustainable development of value chains, local beneficiation of raw materials, and trade, socioeconomic implications of some of these elements, and putting that all together in an agreement, right? So I think that more comprehensive approach is the way to the future to engage with the EU.
Wow, thank you so much, Colette. In each of the questions that have come your way, you have not just provided expert views, but you have also provided some recommendations what actually can be done. If there were masters and PhD students here, I'm sure they would have gotten a lot of research topics because they are questions that need to be investigated further And we need some evidences even from the ground for some of them. The knowledge you have shared here has been very enriching. We want to thank you so much for being with us here on the Trade Union Trade Talks episode 3. It has been a wonder session so far for me. Today's conversation reminds us that trade policy is never neutral. It always affects people in jobs. And as Africa adjusts to post-AGOA landscape, or the new CBAM that you say African governments are resisting vehemently, and other, trade policies from different parts of the world, we must move from reacting to strategically shaping our trade future. Because, like you put it, it is with trade that we can get that perhaps inclusive economic growth for all, because workers are directly affected and workers are at the center of trade. So let us turn today's insights into action, hopefully, and these evidences perhaps into negotiation powers. And as we in the union say, then solidarity will be our torch. Solidarity into what one of the colleagues mentioned in the question, trade justice. So the conversations continue, and so does our responsibility. Once again, thank you. Thanks to all the comrades who have been here and been with us, for an hour and a half, and a lot of people have remained glued to their sets, which is wonderful. Thanks also thanks goes to the interpreters who have been doing a fantastic job. You gave a prompt at the very beginning. It's like, if I'm speaking fast, interpreters, let me know. But I think they have handled it very well, and that is good. So Matt, FES, a big thank you to you as usual, and thank you all. And let's continue pushing. Viva comrades! Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you so
Colette.
much. Thank you, Hod. Thank you, everyone.
Really appreciate it. Goodbye.
Bye.